What's up, guys? This is Fabio Explains. Today we're going to talk about how the Cordyceps in Last of Us is able to infect human brain. To understand how the Cordyceps are able to turn people into zombies, we gotta first understand how generally a pathogen, also known as the infecting organism, is able to infect its target host. I like to break it down to 4 important steps that they need to take. First, they need to get access to their target site. As with most human infection, whether it's going to be viral, bacterial, or fungal, they need to enter the body first. And they can do this through numerous means. This can be as simple as having a cut on the skin that provides an entry for them to get access. Now, secondly, they need to reach their ideal environment of growth. Now, what is the ideal environment will depend on the organism and kind of what their adaptations are. To provide you with an example, athlete's foot is caused by a fungus, which the reason that it grows on the foot is because there is a good amount of moisture and fat available for its growth. Now, the third step, which I think is the most important step, is that the organisms need to evade the host's immune response. Now, in us humans, we have many built-in mechanisms to protect the body. These include having white blood cells, complementary proteins, and antibodies circulating, but it's not only limited to that, and there's also a lot of chemicals involved. However, usually a pathogenic organism has also come up with ways to be able to evade from the immune system successfully. Now, one of the most advanced examples is HIV, which is able to constantly change its outer structure, which will lead to confusion of the immune system, and because of that, the immune system can't really respond strong to it. Now, fourthly, it needs to divide very rapidly in order to have a good amount of growth and to establish itself in the area. And usually when some sort of infection is happening in us and that growth is happening is when we kind of find out that we're sick, as that is the start of also symptoms developing, such as fever, cough, runny nose, and so on. Now that we've understood how generally a pathogen works, we can shift our focus to the cordyceps themselves. And first, we need to talk about how the cordyceps is able to enter the human body. Based by what we see in the game, it looks like the fungus has 2 ways to gain entry. One is through breathing in high amounts of spores, and the other is getting bits by an infected person. Now allow me to elaborate a bit more on how this would work out. And first, let's talk about inhaling the spores. The spore needs to reach the lung if it's going to be able to enter our blood system. However, our body has put protective layers to prevent that from happening. The booger that comes out of your nose is basically a mucus that works as a filter and grabs anything that shouldn't get too much inside of your respiratory system. Now, let's get back to the topic of the spores. If someone breathes in 1 or 2 spores, they're probably not going to get sick, as stuff such as the mucus is going to collect it and prevent the spore from getting inside any deeper. But if you expose the airways with hell load of spores, then there's probably a high chance that 1 or 2 are going to get missed and they're going to reach to the lung. Now, something to add is a part of the lung where the blood system is transporting oxygen with the air is called the alveoli. So when these spores get into that, which is kind of like deep into the lungs, when they get into that, then that is when they can get access to the blood system and start circulating. Now, lung infections are possible. That is something that medically is possible, and the game has gotten it pretty correct. But they don't occur often, and they only occur in certain situations, which is either you got a person who's been breathing in a hell lot of spores, and that will depend on the living environment, or you're dealing with someone who has a weakened immune system. Someone who has gotten, for instance, AIDS will have some issues, or they are taking some medication that's weakening the immune system, such as corticosteroids. Now, also in regards to getting bit by a zombie, this is actually a pretty smart move by the cordyceps. It uses the teeth of the infected to create an opening on the target skin, and then once that opening is made, the spores that are probably residing in the infected's mouth have now an easy access to get into the next person. So, as we talk about this, the spore has been able to find its way into the blood, but now it needs to get itself to the brain, as that is the target. This isn't an easy task, because first it needs to survive by evading from the immune system, and secondly, it needs to go through a major barrier that protects the brain. So, how does Cordyceps survive and how does it evade the immune response? I think most likely they survive by releasing some chemicals which will suppress the immune system. And this is what actually happens when Cordyceps unilateralis, the natural cordyceps species that infects ants and is also the inspiration of the game, this is actually what they do. They release chemicals that evade from the ant's immune response and help them to survive and get the job done. And also, kind of a fun fact to mention, cancer cells also use chemicals to suppress immune system in order for them to survive and grow. But just surviving the immune system is not enough for the cordyceps. It will then need to get through this huge wall surrounding the brain, and as I mentioned, it's called the blood-brain barrier. Now, I'd like to elaborate on the blood-brain barrier. Because our brain is a very sensitive and highly important organ, our body has kind of adapted to come up with an extra layer of protection to ensure its safety. Now, what this layer does is that it works as a filter and prevents from most things to getting into there. It has very small holes, which only a bunch of nutritious material can get through it, so kind of only the essential. And by doing so, this blood-brain barrier makes it tough for organisms to get there and infect it. However, that doesn't make the fact that, let's say, brain infections are impossible. There are a bunch of brain infections that can happen. They can be caused by bacteria, virus, or even fungi. But then again, is it a common thing? Not really. It does happen, but also its severity and how bad it is will depend on the person's medical status. Now, we need to ask the big question of how is the cordyceps able to get through this blood-brain barrier? And I think that we need to look at the unilateralis again. So what these guys are able to do is that they produce enzymes that help to break the ant's skin and help them to get inside the ant. And I think that probably the Cordyceps unilateralis is also doing the same thing by producing some enzymes that creates holes in the blood-brain barrier, and by doing so they can get inside. Although I do have a little bit of issues with this theory, because if they make too many holes, what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of unwanted things in addition to the cordyceps to get inside. And this could lead to major brain damage, and by damaging the brain, it's going to lead to death. And the cordyceps needs the person to be alive in order to kind of turn into the zombie and kind of take control of their activity. So I think probably it's the holes that it might make are not big holes, so it's just enough for it to get through and give it enough time to kind of take over the person's brain. So now that we finally got to see how the cordyceps is able to get inside the brain, the next big question is, where does it go? Which part of the brain does it attach it to? And what is it doing there? And I think to figure that out, we got to see and look at the behavior of a person who's just recently turned into a zombie. If you look at a runner, they are pretty pissed off. They are not rational. You can't talk to them. You can't convince them. And they're really hungry because they want to come and bite you. So these are very important things. Now, when it comes to being a rational person and kind of where our conscious mind comes to, all these decision making and actions happen on the frontal cortex. This is part of the brain where the conscious thinking is originating. So I think the cordyceps goes there as one of the first parts, starts attaching itself there and start reproducing itself there. And it's also releasing some chemicals that's going to help it to activate some of the nerve cells or deactivate some of the nerve cells to the way that it's like. It might sound a little bit cuckoo when I say it releases chemicals, but this is actually what unilateralist does to ants. They release chemicals once they get to the ant's brain, and by releasing those chemicals, it starts to modify the nerve cell activity that's happening there, and the ant starts behaving differently. But this is not enough to turn our Uncle Joe into a hungry, pissed off Uncle Joe. You need to also change their emotion. And where our emotion arises from, that part of the brain is called the limbic system. So probably the cordyceps also releases chemicals that affect the nerve activity there, and they're going to suppress all the other feelings, and it's going to probably put the aggressive state on steroids. So that's where you get a super angry, pissed off zombie that just comes and wants to bite you or kick you and hit you. Now, something that comes down to the idea of biting and wanting to itch you, that's also something that could be an effect done on the limbic system, because also our feeling of hunger does originate from the limbic system. So by also modifying the sense of hunger, it's going to make the person super angry, not angry, sorry, hangry, that's the right word, hungry and angry, and they're going to come and try to bite you off if they get the chance to do it. So now guys, this might be a lot of information, so I wanted to just give a quick summary of all the things that we've discussed about the cordyceps. It first gets access to the body by either using the zombie to bite someone and get inside, or the person is going to breathe in a lot of spores and they're going to become infected. Once it's been able to get into the blood, it is going to produce chemicals, which is going to help it to evade the immune system. Then once it gets to the brain, it's going to probably release some enzymes that's going to break down part of the blood-brain barrier and create holes for it to get inside the brain. Now that it's in the brain, it's going to attach itself to the frontal cortex. It's going to start releasing chemicals, inhibiting activity on that site, which is going to make the individual irrational. And also it's going to release chemicals affecting the limbic system, which will turn individuals to a always hungry and pissed off person. And by doing that, it's been able to successfully infect an individual and will go on to infect more people. So there you have it, folks. That's my take on the cellular biology of the cordyceps. If you stayed till this end, I wanted to give you a special thanks. But now I have a question for you. If you had to choose between Last of Us Part 1 or Last of Us Part 2, which one would you go? Let me know down below. And with that said, until next time, take care. Ellie could have played an important role in the discovery of the cure for cordyceps brain infection, but what the physician wanted to do was completely wrong.